Hi, welcome to the Praxis Report, the podcast where theory meets practice and where politics is dissected through a revolutionary perspective. I am your co-host, Jonathan Brown.
And I'm your co-host, William Barth.
And today we are going to be discussing the Trump administration's targeting of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as his criticism of woke language and the question of identity politics on the left. We're going to ask this central question: is Trump returning us to the dark ages of Jim Crow segregation, or is this something different? Is there something more going on the surface, beneath the surface of this culture war? And so the main catalyst to us discussing this in this episode is a particular executive order, I believe, or legislation that Trump had introduced. This is from NPR last week, and it says here, segregated facilities are no longer explicitly banned in federal contracts. And there's this image from Jackson, Mississippi, which is where I have, my family is from, actually. And in 1961 with the, segregated waiting rooms for coloreds only. And apparently there was a public memo issued by the government that said that civil federal agencies would no longer have to be explicitly prohibited from signing contracts with businesses that have segregated restaurants, waiting rooms, or drinking fountains. So this goes back to the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. And the article does go on to say that this is it doesn't actually cause any tangible change necessarily, because it's more of a symbolic move, because all the federal civil rights legislation is still in place. So it's still illegal to discriminate on the basis of race or gender or nationality. But Trump signing this bill that sort of says it's no longer explicit in the language of the law to prohibit the government from contracting with services that are segregated. A lot of commentary I've been reading has been from, a lot of liberals who have assumed this means the return of Jim Crow, or that we are going to get back to a sort of segregation being the law of the land. Now, that might be a bit overblown, but there is a concern, of course, with this sort of idea that Trump is a white nationalist of sorts that's going to slide us back into a segregated apartheid-like regime. So we're going to be discussing that today in the episode. Will, what are your initial thoughts of this issue and Trump's policy here?
Well, it's a very profound question, John. So I think we have to use care in our analysis here.
Yeah.
Obviously, just on the surface, I mean, the great sort of context of the 1950s and 1960s civil rights era was the whole idea of what they called states' rights, and the whole legacy of segregation, which is a system of government, for people who don't understand it, in which African Americans were governed by a separate set of laws than other Americans. So African Americans couldn't, sit at a restaurant with white Americans. They couldn't swim in a public pool with white Americans. They couldn't own a house in a white area. They were the first fired and last hired on a job. Basically treated more or less not as slaves, but as little better than slaves in the United States, as particularly in the southern states. In the northern states, the segregation laws were a little different. You had more of a kind of a silent segregation where social custom kept blacks, African Americans, segregated in all areas of American life. But the basic problem, the basic aspect or distinguishing characteristic of segregation was this idea that localities, states should decide for themselves how they want to treat African Americans. If they wanted to have segregation or have racial separation between whites and blacks, and that includes in not only just in legal and social, and legal and civil aspects, but in social aspects. In other words, blacks and whites were not allowed to date each other. They couldn't marry. They couldn't have children together. It was a complete separation of the races, but it wasn't an equal separation, although segregationists would argue separate and equal. But what we know from the actual the reality of what was taking place was it was separate and unequal, but in a gross sort of fashion, because we weren't that many years separated from slavery, where African Americans were just basically human slaves, treated more or less like animals, although I don't think we were that cruel to animals, to be candid, as we were to humans who lived under slavery.
Right. Yeah. So the issue that we're going to get into with this episode is there is a two-sided debate going on in America for the last couple of years, maybe even longer than that, between the liberal and the conservative position on racism. The liberal position we have, which it goes by different terms. It used to be in the 90s, they would call it political correctness. Today, they call it woke or identity politics, or sometimes like diversity. There's also on the right is a more sort of conservative backlash to identity politics, to diversity, to wokeism. And what we kind of see happening is the liberals have sort of won the culture war in a lot of ways, in the sense that, if you went back to the 1960s or the 1900 or the 1800s, white supremacy was an actual dominant, accepted mainstream ideology. And it wasn't something that was said in behind closed doors or done in a subconscious way. It was overt. It was a dominating ideology that was voiced with pride, from all the way up to the president of the United States, to leaders of government and business. It was the law of the land that was enforced on the books. Whereas in the post-civil rights era of America, overt racism and overt white supremacy has been shunned in favor of, an ideology that we should have diversity, we should be inclusive, there should be equality. And yet the persistence of racial inequality still remains. And so there's a debate of why is there still racial injustice, racial inequality? Why is there not egalitarian reality between white and black in America? And that's an issue that I think the liberals have pushed this idea of identity as the forefront, to lead with race as an identity. So that the kind of agenda is that corporations, businesses, banks, government institutions, the military, all facets of public life, hegemony should be, diversified, so that you have the CEO of a corporation should not just be a bunch of white men, but there should be women, there should be black people, there should be people of all sexual orientations. You should have a diverse military, you should have a diverse CIA, diverse government, diverse, Wall Street banks. And I think that this sort of, that sort of corporate identity politics and corporate diversity leads to a lot of division and conflict, which is where people like Trump capitalize on the sort of discontent that people have with corporate superficial diversity initiatives. So what is your take on that issue?
Yeah, and again, these are large questions. So I guess the best way to do it is kind of take it one at a time.
Yeah.
let me start with the civil rights movement just briefly. This was also a great question during this civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. The great debate within the movement was between Martin Luther King Jr.'s campaign. By the way, I have Martin Luther King here, always watching over me, make sure I'm staying straight here on my on my analysis. The great question of the civil rights movement was, should the goal of civil rights be, there was sort of universal agreement that we needed to end lawful segregation. That, in other words, black people, African Americans, should not be governed by a separate set of laws and rules that were degrading and subjugating in every way.
Right.
Both in social and economic life. That was one aspect of it. There was, I would say, universal agreement on that question. However, there was not universal agreement on whether the goal should be racial integration. Integration was the goal. In other words, that all of these institutions should be integrated and that African Americans should be able to participate with whites in all institutions. A noble goal, but there was another strand of the civil rights, you might call it human rights movement, and that was led by people like Malcolm X, who argued that no, the goal should be sort of African American self-determination, in effect, separation. So that strand of the movement said that no, diversity should not be the goal. Integration should not be the goal. Instead, the goal should be some sort of self-development or self-determination within the group that would build the group to be self-supportive in and of itself. In other words, African Americans, qua African Americans, would you resort to what you might call self-help, to develop themselves, to develop the group and uplift the group so that it could have equality with the majority white or Caucasian group, but it not through integration, not through diversity, but through actual the group itself owning its own economic institutions, its own financial institutions, having its own political self-determination, meaning, running for offices and so forth. So sort of, I think the analogy might be in colonial societies around the world. You have, campaigns to end colonialism, and segregation was a form of colonialism. The colonialized group would resort to sort of self-help and self-determination against the, for lack of a better term, the white master, to develop itself, to develop itself economically, and politically, but the first steps to that were always sort of social and cultural. In other words, the group had to sort of kind of withdraw into itself and progress as a group without integrating and so forth, because the group, one of the harms of colonialism or segregation is psychological harm to the group. So if African Americans were not only socially and politically harmed, but psychologically harmed. In other words, back in the day, segregation days, if you were African American, you developed sort of personal pathologies. Kinky hair was viewed as ugly, so black African Americans tried to straighten their hair. Dark skin was viewed as ugly, so African Americans would try to lighten their skin. The African American characteristics were viewed as ugly, so people would grow up. There was this great study called Simple Justice of how black youth viewed themselves, and they would show, the black youth who attended segregated schools, they would show them two dolls, a white Barbie doll and a black doll, and they would ask the little boy or girl, which is the pretty one and which is the ugly one, and of course the African American student would choose the white doll as the pretty doll, and the black doll would be the ugly doll. So to overcome this sort of psychological pathology, the group had to sort of turn inward and self-determine its own destiny in every aspect: psychological, cultural, social, and political. So that was the other strand. And there was this debate about whether African Americans should integrate diversity with whites or actually separate and sort of almost like start your own country within your country. And actually there was talk back in the days of, actually black African Americans separating and making large parts of the South, the southern states, what they called New Africa, much like the northern, the southern states were New England. We'll have a New Africa in Alabama and Mississippi. That might have been an interesting idea where African culture and language and so forth could have been developed. But anyway, so this debate about wokeism and diversity has roots into this his sort of more historic conflict between separation versus integration as a strategy for African American equity and equality in America. So anyway.
Yeah, and I think the question of integration, it's sort of one thing that was actually all of the civil rights leaders, that, they often depict Martin Luther King as being more of a moderate, but in reality, even King at the time, they would all argue that just integration alone was not going to be enough to solve the extent of the problem. And I think, if you go back even to the debates around the abolition movement of slavery, the question was not simply, abolish slavery and then what do you do? Because if a people have been enslaved and then segregated for centuries, generationally, there needs to be some program of uplift in order to eliminate that. And there were attempts to do that after the Civil War with the Reconstruction that ultimately, unfortunately, failed.
Yeah, the 40 acres and a mule program of
exactly
free slave land and equipment, I guess, to develop economically.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been a program of land reform that would have redistributed the plantations that were owned by the slaveholders and given them to the former slaves. But you still have, I think, this similar issue today in that what sort of the idea that won out was a sort of integrationist approach, but it was one that didn't connect integration with any sort of class analysis or material analysis of
or structural change, maybe
any structural change whatsoever. I mean, at the most you could say is that the structure of the legal system of Jim Crow was destroyed, and so overt segregation is no longer legal, and that sort of but because there was no sort of more thorough structural change behind that, what it led to was that the capitalist system is able to say, well, now we have a new group of people we can allow to integrate into our ranks, into into the higher echelons of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class, but we can keep the masses, of course, poor, living in ghettos, locking them in prisons, working in low-wage jobs. But there is going to be a new sector of the elite that is now racially diverse. And that is an ideology that is used by capitalism itself. Every corporation promotes diversity. Every corporation has a HR department that enforces anti-racism and diversity and equity and inclusion as part of its corporate newspeak. The government enforces that ideology. The military, the CIA, the State Department, they all promote that ideology because it's a way of sort of legitimizing capitalism by saying that capitalism is good if it's actually a diverse system.
And it also makes the mistake of saying that somehow racism is it's a personal problem. It's your attitude.
Yes.
You have an attitude. You don't like people who are different.
Yes.
distinguished by some kind of ethnic or racial characteristic. And that's the problem we must overcome. We must get you as an individual to be more accepting of people who are different. And that's where you get this where Trump exploits that, and you get this terrible rebelling against DUI, against so-called wokeism. We're going to talk about wokeism a little bit, I know, in a moment. But DUI, wokeism, diversity training. If there's one thing that I think upsets, the white folks more, is this idea of diversity and equity and DUI, because it says somehow, that they're racist, that they have some personal issue, and that's why we're in the condition we're in. That it's not a structural problem. That it's somehow your personal attitude. Now, that's not to say that attitudes are not influenced by the structure that causes segregation and apartheids and so forth, and because a culture does emerge out of such a structure. Yeah. So there is a role for training about that, what you'd call tolerance for those who are different. So tolerance training is important. In South Africa, you had truth and reconciliation programs between blacks and whites post-apartheid. These things are important. I just tend to think, and I don't want to take you away from your strand of thinking, but I think it's really important that we not move away from, or that we've lost connection with the problems of African Americans. I mean, that America had gone through this problem, this whole experience with human slavery, the African slave trade, and then this whole period of lawful segregation that lasted, another more than 100 years after the end of lawful human slavery. And then you have this African American community trapped in these structures.
Right.
And somehow, with the emergence of DUI, wokeism, diversity training, the whole question of what happens to African Americans, I think, got lost. When you look at federal programs, like I worked at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So many of those HUD programs over the decades were simply responses to lawful segregation and the condition of communities in terms of housing, economic development, homelessness after segregation. Like, as if segregation was like they were like communities, affected by war. They were in such devastated conditions, and the people who lived in them. So if you look at the condition of, for lack of a better term, the African American masses or the black masses, the problems of mass incarceration, the unlawful extrajudicial executions of African Americans, police shootings disproportionately with whites, mass incarceration of blacks, and also just the wealth gap between blacks and whites in America. When you look at all of these things, the condition of African Americans in the United States today, you see that Martin Luther King's dream truly was not accomplished. And here we are in the year 2025, and we're actually talking about the reinvigoration of sort of social segregation, and the African American communities being left in conditions where they have not attained equality with whites. And this is the great unfinished business of America. I mean,
yeah,
is the whole struggle from the 1960s forward, and for my generation, to achieve black equality failed.
Right. Well, I think that there's no way to really tackle those issues without focusing on the economic foundation of race in America. Because when I teach my history classes, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, I think liberals today tend to think that slavery they have it backwards. They think that slavery and racism started because white people were just sitting there and just had this attitude in their head where they said, oh, white people are superior and these people are inferior, so we're just going to enslave them for no reason. But right. The reality of that is reversed, that the slave trade was an economic system. It was a class system. Slavery itself has been around for thousands of years. all the ancient societies during antiquity practiced slavery. The transatlantic slave trade during the last 400 years took on a racial characteristic because the Europeans that were colonizing the Americas wanted to extract raw materials and natural resources to fuel their economies and their industrialization from the Americas, and they needed labor to work in the fields and to work agriculture to get those raw materials. And they were using slave labor, and to justify that, to provide a reason to say, why is it okay that we are not paying people, we are forcing them into labor? The ideology, the idea, the attitude was something that emerged to say that Europeans are superior to Africans. And then it went from sort of a Christian ideal, because there wasn't originally just all Europeans are white, it was a Christendom, and
Right.
were heathens who were non-believers, to then being a scientific, or we would now say pseudoscientific justification that no, it's a biological difference based in race and skin color and etc. So the justification was always there, but it was based in a sort of economic system.
Right. So what you're saying is that the structure produced the social context or the attitude.
The culture. Yeah.
First, you had the structure. You needed, the economic imperative of human slavery. You needed that structure for the system to create profit and economic development and prosperity for the owners of the structure. And out of that evolved social attitudes about the inferiority of African races to European races, and also cultural attitudes, Christianity being a superior religious belief to, say, other or even indigenous African religions and so forth. So you're saying and this is the problem, because when you have diversity and DUI and so forth, those programs focus on the attitude, but the attitude is the result of the structural problem. So people get upset because they say, well, wait a minute, I'm not a racist. You'll even hear Trump say this. Trump was very famous for saying this famous line: "You'll never meet anybody who's more against racism or more pro-black, for lack of a better term, than Donald Trump." And he does. He has, African American friends. He's an entertainer. He's primarily is an entertainer. That's
right.
That's part of his success. He knows how to play to the camera. He's an entertainer. That's his career. And
I think you're right, and I think focusing on the attitude and the belief that people have it's attacking the problem backwards, and it's ineffective, because if you come at people and say the reason racism exists is not because there's a structure in place to profit from exploiting people, but the reason racism exists is because Joe Sixpack over there has bad attitudes and bad thoughts inside of his brain, then
right.
Yeah, so then you create a sort of defensive-ness in people and a division where people then are attacking each other and saying, well, hey, I'm not the one who caused the problem, I'm not the one who did, So then instead of it being a way to bring people to change the structure, it sort of just continues to perpetuate a conflict and a division. And then I think for conservatives, they see that big businesses and corporations and Hollywood are promoting those narratives, and then that invites a backlash to them to where they reject the whole idea, and it creates more of a us versus them mentality. So rather than actually solving or advancing the cause of anti-racism, it actually does the opposite. It makes it so that there's more division and more conflict and more resentment between people.
Right. That is perfectly framed, as always, John. But I would add something to, I think, some parts of traditional left or Marxian analysis, which is, well, if we had revolutionary socialism, we would solve the problem. And I would say, no, you still need the sort of a Pan-Africanist component to it, because I mean, even under the Soviet, Marxist kind of analysis, you need to have a kind of cultural development for colonialized peoples before they can become sort of what they used to say back in the 40s, sort of ready for socialism. In other words, there has to be sort of a social and cultural development. So there needs to be sort of a Afrocentric focus to the liberation struggle, which can be based on revolutionary socialism in part, but also there needs to be a social or cultural strong component, if not a leading social and cultural component, called Pan-Africanism. Now, this is a subject that of some debate in socialist circles, and again, people like Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, would talk about this all the time. He was a revolutionary socialist, but he's also a Pan-Africanist, and he said the two were fundamentally go together, that you couldn't use, say, European approaches to socialism to liberate the black masses. It would have to be a form of Pan-Africanist socialism. Kind of like how you discuss it, like you always say, you can have revolution in China, but it would be revolution based on Chinese characteristics, or revolution in the United States. It would have to be based on revolution with American characteristics. Well, much the same, that was Kwame Ture's approach, that it would have to be revolutionary socialism led by a Pan-Africanist social and cultural development and thought and so forth. So, and given the condition of the black masses, I would argue they are different than the condition of the white masses, which are also, not good in current day America. But the black masses are, have a set of historical and social aspects to it that make it even much worse. And the remedy needs to incorporate the condition of the black masses, the unique characteristics that led to those conditions. And again, this is the problem with diversity and DEI and so forth, is it just does not address the structural problem at all. And in fact, if anything, it's taken us away from the African American struggle for equality, because that's no longer the focus of DEI and wokeism and so forth. In fact, it's almost as if the whole struggle of Black America has been sort of subsumed in this sort of DEI wokeism kind of context, and we've lost all of these discussions about Pan-Africanism, Black social and economic development and cultural development. All of that is lost.
Yeah, that's true. I totally agree, and I think that you have to have a component of culture in socialist uplift, so that it would be targeting the structure, but it would have to be aware of the fact that every group in America has experienced exploitation and oppression differently. And so the conditions of the black masses would have to be at the forefront, not just economically, but culturally as well, and psychologically, and in all the ways that you mentioned. And I think the problem we've seen recently is that there's been just this divorcing of class from the conversation about race. Right. So the extent of what you might have called woke back in the old days would have been much more aware of the structural oppressions. Today, woke has just been an empty signifier that just doesn't really mean anything other than just like, let's have a Disney movie about the Little Mermaid where we have Ariel played by a black woman. That's what woke means now. It doesn't have any reference to actual structural problems by facing the black community as a whole.
You think you can call up that where woke comes from?
Oh, yes. Well, let's talk about, this would be a good thing for us to play out to end on, I think would be a good note.
Yeah, maybe we can end on what wokeism really is.
Yeah, so this here, can you see this video here?
Yes, we can.
Cool. Okay, so this is so Leadbelly was a cool guy. He was a blues musician. He played guitar and sang back in the 1920s and 30s. And he wrote this song about the Scottsboro case in Alabama. And this is the first one, or maybe, I don't know, the first or one of the first times someone used the term stay woke.
Stay woke.
And Will, do you want to just say briefly what the
Yeah.
Scottsboro case was?
So, I don't want to get into it's a case in which there's a lot of literature around, but basically it was a group of young teenage African Americans who were riding the trains as people, so-called hobos were often doing back in the day. They would hop on a train to go from town to town, and these teenagers who were young and African American were hopping the trains, traveling from city to city down south, and they got off a train in Alabama, and apparently there was a couple of white teenage women on the same train with the black teenagers, and so when the kids got off, almost immediately. Apparently, there was some authorities, and there was a quick accusation that the black teenagers had raped these two white teenage girls. Yeah. And there was a famous trial, and the black youth who were on this train were almost immediately convicted. These were trials down in Alabama back in segregation days, and these young teenagers were jailed and sentenced to death. And of course, there were extensive appeals, and eventually, apparently the women recanted, and eventually, as the case went up on appeal, the boys apparently were freed after being jailed for some like decade or more. And Leadbelly, this famous blues singer, who I highly recommend, especially for people who like the blues music, should listen to, because his music is just absolutely incredible. He kind of tells you what the term woke means, and we can play it. But just to summarize Leadbelly's description of woke and wokeism, it was Leadbelly's urging to African Americans to stay aware when they're traveling in segregated Alabama or segregated Mississippi, because if you're not aware of your surroundings when you're traveling, you could be picked up and accused of rape or lynched, hung by a tree and killed. And so staying woke was a way, it was a warning. It was warning to African Americans: stay aware of your surroundings, be careful when you travel in these segregated communities. You could be killed. You could be accused of awful crimes. You could be tortured. You could be murdered. Stay woke. And go ahead, John. Maybe you can
watch it. Yeah, let's listen to it.
Some loud cry about the boys being there with the women. You see, that is all it was to it. They just saw the women. They didn't see nothing else wrong. But anyhow, they put the boys in jail, and in that 6 long years, brother, the state, all the whole United States got together. They got out for them when they come to New York. And the lawyer what got him out, I know him pretty good. I met him. And he showed me the Scottsboro boys. I shake hands with him, so I made this little song about down there. So I advise to be a little careful when they go along through that, but stay woke, keep your eyes open.
Stay woke, keep your eyes open.
Stay woke and keep your eyes open. Yeah, and that's
so that's a quite different definition of woke than what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and I think it's quite often that we see radical ideas get co-opted and get sold out and watered down and become sort of, empty slogans that are packaged and sold and become a commodity.
And again, we totally divorced from the condition. We've divorced wokeism from the condition of the black masses that Leadbelly was talking about, right. which was, you couldn't even travel without being threatened with torture, murder, or arrest. And, right. If you were African American, we don't think of wokeism that way or DUI that way anymore. And it's so divorced from the original intent.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, because we have not achieved, Martin Luther King's, the dream of African American equality. And, how many centuries is it going to take? I've always advocated we should have a Department of African American Affairs at the cabinet level, and in any event, that's another.
Yeah, but I mean, Leadbelly's advice was good advice.
Yes.
I guess now you would have to stay woke of the fake woke.
Yeah, stay woke about the fake woke.
Yeah, you have to stay woke about that too. But that's what we're trying to do on the Praxis report. We're trying to analyze and theorize and provide some solutions to the real serious problems that are going on in this country. So thank you all for tuning in. I've been your co-host. My name is Jonathan Brown, and I'm here with.
Thank you, co-host William Barth, and want to urge everybody stay woke.
Stay woke. Be sure to like our channel, subscribe. If you enjoy this video, we have plenty more coming up. Stay tuned. Peace, y'all.
Peace.